Today I will tell you a curious story that has left everyone who has heard it puzzled. The tragic story of the man who was crushed between the runway and his bomber. This story has been told in multiple books from that time by people who witnessed it or heard about it. Since it's anecdotal, it's often seen as a myth. However, today, besides telling this story, we will also analyze its truthfulness so we can determine if it's true or just a legend spread among bomber crew members. So you'd better get comfortable and welcome to Guns Club. As I said, there are many versions of this story, but they all seem to originate from Andy Rooney's 1995 book, My War. The following was taken from the book Master of the Air in Chapter 5, and it goes like this. While Rooney and other reporters waited in front of a control tower for a squadron of bombers to return, word spread that a ball turret gunner was trapped in his bubble underneath the plane. The gears that turned the ball to put the gunner in firing position and then return him to the position that allowed him to get out had been hit and were jammed. The ball turret gunner was trapped in a plastic cage. Two of its engines were really damaged. Right before landing, the fortress's electrical and hydraulic systems failed, making it impossible for the pilot to lower the landing gear. The emergency crank to operate the main landing gear had also been destroyed by enemy fire. The pilot had to make a belly landing. There were 8 minutes of heartbreaking conversation between the tower, the pilot, and the man trapped in the ball turret. We all knew what hits first when there are no wheels. In the end, there was silence, and after a moment, we all watched in horror at what happened. We saw how that man's life ended. He was dragged and scraped for hundreds of meters between the concrete pavement of the runway and the belly of the bomber. Along with the story in the book, this photo appears, reminding us how difficult the work of bomber crews was in World War I Nysa Bay. Andy Rooney in post-war books, he also gives us much more context about this story, providing information about the place and even the date. In addition to details such as the fact that the bomber didn't last just a few minutes, but spent 2 hours flying over the airfield waiting for a solution. This story is highly questioned because there is only anecdotal evidence. But then, is it real or is it fiction? Well, let's analyze this in depth by confirming the following points. First, is it possible to get trapped in a turret, Sperry? In the book, we see that it is mentioned that the gunner was trapped. Even in the documentary World War I in high definition, they released an alleged communications audio where the gunner confirms it. It's possible to get trapped in a turret. And this is certainly possible, even if you don't believe it. The turret couldn't be destroyed just by kicking it with your feet. It was armored to withstand gunfire. Also, for the gunner to exit, a rear door was used, which was located directly opposite the weapons. In other words, to get out, the gunner had to align the weapons perpendicular to the bomber. This way, the door could be aligned with the hole in the bomber. The turret was electric and could also be operated from the cockpit. So, if the gunner was wounded and couldn't operate the turret, they could get him out very easily. In this particular photo, we see how the turret was pointing forward, confirming that the gunner indeed couldn't get out, and matching the story that was told. Also, in the story from the book, it says that the plane's electrical systems, as well as the gears responsible for operating the turret, were jammed. Therefore, it makes sense that the gunner couldn't get out, so getting trapped inside a Sperry turret was very possible, if you were unlucky. Let's analyze the consistency between the reported damage and the one in the photo. You might think that this damage to the turret would be insufficient, considering that 13 tons of weight fell on it. However, even when the landing gear is raised on B-17S, the landing gear is never completely hidden. Instead, the wheels remain slightly exposed relative to the fuselage, providing some resistance during crash landings and separating the bomber. The damage is more than consistent with what was described. Now, why didn't the gunner jump out of the bomber? With the turret pointed forward, this allowed the rear hatch to be clear, letting the gunner jump out. However, in the Sperry turrets, the space was quite limited, making it impossible to hold a parachute. For the gunner, the parachutes were right above the turret hatch, so the gunners had no way to stop their fall if they were thrown out of the turret. In World War I, there are many stories of gunners who strap parachutes to their chests so that, if needed, they could stop their fall in the air. However, it was not something standardized. The gunner in the story might not have had a parachute and simply couldn't jump. If he couldn't jump, then why not release the turret? Have a parachute? The turret of the B-17 Flying Fortress was the only spherical turret among Allied bombers in World War II that was not retractable. That is, in a crash landing where there is no landing gear. Certainly, the turret would be the first thing to hit the ground, being crushed by the weight of the bomber. If someone was inside, it would be wise to release it before landing. The turret on the B-17S could be released if needed. We discussed that topic in a previous video on this channel. I highly recommend it. But in summary, if a bomber had substantial damage and the pilot realized they weren't going to make it back to base, the crew would prepare for a crash landing. For this, they would drop the ball turret to the ground if needed. It could be released simply by removing a series of bolts that kept it attached to the plane. By dropping the turret, they could get more kilometers because it lightened the plane. Additionally, this allowed the bomber to belly land without substantial structural damage. Belly landing with the turret could cause greater damage to the structure of the plane, making the emergency landing more complicated. The whole process of removing the turret took about 20 minutes. Dropping the turret with a gunner inside right before landing seemed like a good idea. But maybe at that stressful moment, the crew of that B-17 didn't think so. According to all these points, everything narrated by Andy Rooney in the book Masters of the Air could be true. So why does everyone say this story is false? Well, in Andy Rooney's book, which came after my war, called Sincerely, the writer gives more interesting details about this story, such as the place and the date, which made it easier to investigate this event. Many people thoroughly investigated Rooney's story, but the most accurate research was done by the user Noah307 from the Warbeard Information Exchange Forum, org. Credit to him, he did a great job. According to Rooney, the events took place on August 17, 1943 at the Basingbourn Air Base in England, where the 91 Saint bombardment group was operating. Only one accident happened on this date. It was mission number 84, in which 4 squadrons operated: the 32nd, the 33rd, the 34th, and the 41st Bombardment Squadron. According to the daily reports from these squadrons, there was only one casualty that day. Technical Sergeant Donald F. Robertson Bordeaux from the B-17F4 124639. So the gunner who fell that day had to be that man, since it is confirmed in the book that he died on the runway. So couldn't it have been someone missing or wounded? However, Robertson was a radio operator, not a gunner, so Rooney's story is completely false. Certainly, something like what Rooney described should have been a story worth recording in the daily reports, but there also had to be many more witnesses. It was a busy runway, and in Rooney's books, it is mentioned that many people saw the event. If the account of the story by Rooney, who was a direct witness to the events, is false, then clearly any other could also be flawed, or at least exaggerated. However, I think this is one of those stories that is up to each person's interpretation whether it's real or not. Share your thoughts in the comments. If you like this video, you might want to watch the story of the Chinook 74 crash. It's an interesting story. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.